Two people have been arrested after the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer was swarmed by protesters yesterday. Police had to help Starmer escape after they surrounded him. Those protesters surrounded him, of course, as well as shadowing Foreign Secretary David Lammy near Parliament.
Some in the protest group were shouting traitor, criticising Sir Keir's record on COVID, and cries were also heard of Jimmy Savile after, of course, the Prime Minister made a claim last week in Parliament, a false claim that Sir Keir personally failed to prosecute serial sex offender Jimmy Savile when he was Director of Public Prosecutions.
Well, here to give his reaction is Stephen Pound, the former Labour MP for Ealing North. Welcome to the programme, Stephen.
Thank you, Ted.
First of all, I've watched quite a few of these videos now this morning in pretty close detail. Yes, there was one person who seemed to be shouting in a deranged way about Jimmy Savile, but there were lots of other people who were shouting about Magna Carta, about the New World Order, about vaccinations, about Julian Assange. There were lots of nutters here, weren't there?
Well, there was also somebody shouting Freemason, Freemason. I think you can accuse Keir of many things, but not that. Look, what this really was, I mean, there were some moon-howlingly mad people there, without a shadow of a doubt. And I have to say, Piers Corbyn should actually take a long, slow look at himself and think, is the world really ready for this sort of insanity? So I think one of the real problems we've got here is that one of the difficulties we have in modern politics is that dissociation, the separation of politicians and the people. People say we're out of touch, they don't have the ability to actually relate to ordinary people. The more this happens, the less chance there is of politicians actually being with the people they represent. I used to travel back on the bus from Parliament every day, and every single day somebody would come up to me and said, bet you're claiming this on expenses, aren't you, or whatever. But they didn't shout at me or thump me or anything. But I was tempted to actually, maybe, drive in and out of Parliament, who knows. The problem with this is that anybody's now going to say, why on earth should we risk being out on the street? And probably the maddest, the most loony thing was Piers Corbyn saying, but Keir Starmer deliberately came out there to provoke us. This is a setup. Was it a coincidence? I mean, dear God in heaven, I think that really takes howling at the moon beyond any sort of astral plane, in my opinion.
And I think, sadly, it's wishful thinking to expect Piers Corbyn to, be introspective and take a hard look at himself in the mirror. But what do you think the solution to all of this is? Because there is that freedom to protest, isn't there? Of course, there's no freedom to actually hurt anybody or intimidate anybody. But we have to strike a balance, don't we? But by protecting our politicians, who are increasingly, or do seem increasingly under threat, whilst also maintaining that freedom of people to come out onto the streets and protest.
It's a wonderfully philosophical point. I think it was Isaiah Berlin who said, freedom for the wolf doesn't necessarily mean freedom for the lamb. And I think the situation we've got here is we cherish the right of free speech. Of course we do. What we don't cherish and what we don't allow and we cannot condone is this sort of lunatic mob assault on a person doing their job, going about their business in Parliament. Look, we do have public order offences in this country. We've got to realise that there is a difference between free speech, which we cherish, which you champion, and fair play to you, and this sort of bonkers behaviour. I think what we need to actually concentrate on last night was not the free speech aspect, but the public order aspect. It's like when Chris Whitty was assaulted, I don't think that's too strong a word, in St James's Park by these people grabbing him around the neck, putting him in a neck hold, saying, give us a selfie. And quite rightly, they got banged up for that. This is a public order thing. I don't think this is to do with free speech. I think this is to do with, self-serving, narcissistic idiots making absolute fools of themselves. And in all honesty, giving Boris Johnson a real headache, because it was this time last week that Boris repeated or sort of instigated this appalling slur about Jimmy Savile. And you can't tell me that didn't resonate.
Well, let's speak about that in some more detail. There have been lots of claims that this was Boris Johnson's fault, that he instigated this mob. But as far as I can see, this mob amassed because they were protesting vaccines, right? One person seemed very exercised about Jimmy Savile, but there were over a dozen others in that mob who didn't mention Savile at all. Can we really lay the blame at the feet of the Prime Minister?
No, of course we can't. Not for the totality of the mob. What we can lay at the feet of the Prime Minister is exactly the same as David Davis has said, as 6 Tory MPs have said, and as many of his own people have said, that this was the wrong thing to say. It wasn't just inaccurate, it wasn't just undignified, it was actually provocative. And there are certain people who will actually accept that as a green light. Now, I take your point. This wasn't an entirely Jimmy Savile was not prosecuted demonstration. This did have every single, sort of 1,001, never 57 at least varieties of lunacy. But I don't care what people say. What Boris Johnson said on the floor of the House that day took politics to a new low. It took it into a dark, deep, and really quite disgusting place. And I think that did actually stimulate some people. It's a bit like, Trump and January last year. Did Trump incite the attack on the White House? He didn't say, this is the way to the White House, tool up, lads, and get on down there. But what he did do, he ramped up, the background noise in such a way that he opened the door for those people. I think Boris Johnson is not personally culpable for this attack last night, but by God, he's complicit within it. And I think that he's part of that problem. And I also think, in all honesty, he knows that.
It's interesting. Is it Keir Starmer is someone on the floor of the House of Commons who has brought up his record as DPP many times. He's spoken about how he was responsible for every prosecution that occurred in the country. Spoke about how under his watch terrorists were prosecuted, rapists were prosecuted, very, very bad people were prosecuted. Is it not legitimate, therefore, to say if Keir Starmer takes responsibility for all of the successful, and there were many, many successful prosecutions under his watch, should he not also take responsibility for the failures that happened under his watch, even if he was not personally involved in them?
He should take responsibility, and he has taken responsibility of the decisions that he took on his watch. I mean, I worked with him in Northern Ireland, and he was an extraordinarily capable man who actually managed to sort of bridge the great traditional divides that we have in Northern Ireland. And he took responsibility for all those cases where he was the decision maker. He was the case officer, he was the review officer. In the case of Savile, he was none of those things. Now, you can say that ultimately power just drifts upwards until you find the person who's responsible. On that basis, the Queen is responsible because ultimately she's the boss of the whole organisation. You should say that any time anything goes wrong with any Conservative politician who gets up to something a bit outrageous, it's Boris Johnson's fault because he is at the top of that tree. I'm sorry. What you have to have is individual responsibility, individual culpability. I take your point, Tom, and it's actually a pretty good point that Keir has actually said, I've done this is my backstory, these are my credentials. And, that is a two-edged sword. But I think in the case of Savile, nobody says for a moment that he was the review officer or he was the case officer or he was the decision maker. But he was the boss of those people. But should he have known every single thing? Do you know how many cases the DPP deals with every day? And, the reality is that I think it'd be pretty hard-pressed to lay that one at Keir's door.